Hey Chris, this is Eddie Guerrero. Hi Nancy, how you doing? This is Eddie, Big E, Shaw, and Sherilyn. And we all want to say hello to you and Daniel and Chris and the whole family. We hope you guys are doing great. And
the little boy and the mom are dead, and so I ran out to scream to them, but then they went in the house and they haven't come out yet.
Hold on just a moment.
Some disturbing new details tonight in the apparent double murder suicide at pro wrestler Chris Benoit's Georgia home. Cops saying in a press conference just a couple of hours ago that they found the wrestler hanging.
Benoit.
You mean Chris Benoit?
Chris Benoit.
Chris Benoit.
Is crazy.
Chris Benoit. Ha. The reason why I purposely mispronounced Chris Benoit's name is because when I was a child, I was very angry at him. Finding out he ended the lives of his wife and 7-year-old child disappointed me. I was 9 years old at the time and could barely understand the full depth of his actions, but I still hated him for it. I was ashamed of my admiration of him on stage. Even though it had nothing to do with me, I still felt connected to what he represented on stage. And because of that, I had a whole lot of anger and a whole lot of resentment. Hence, Chris Benoit. Also, a quick note for you guys. I know I've been gone for like the past month and a half, 2 months, and I'm very sorry about that. I don't plan on being like Corey X Kenshin where he's like taking month-long breaks or whatever. That is not my goal. I'm going to be much more consistent going forward. I'm sorry. That will literally never happen ever again unless I'm like retiring or something, okay? So sorry about that, guys. Back to the video. Christopher Michael Benoit was a professional wrestler with an illustrious career. With nicknames like the Rabid Wolverine, Pegasus Kid, and the best damned technical wrestler in the world, he wasn't short of accolades and prestige. He was a very big deal. Which is why when the news came that he ended the lives of his entire family and his own, everyone was confused. June 23, 2007, Benoit was supposed to show up for one of the most important matches of his wrestling career. But much to everyone's surprise, he never showed up. You guys have to realize that Benoit was slated to fight against CM Punk and win his 3rd world championship. This event was a huge deal for both WWE and ECW. With thousands of fans disappointed and Vince McMahon scrambling to find Chris, nobody saw this coming. Here's a detailed account of what happened over that fateful weekend. June 22nd, 2007. Friday. It started out as a weekend full of errands and fun. Around 8:30 a.m., Benoit dropped his son off at horse riding camp, which was conveniently placed at his next door neighbor's house. His neighbor, Holly Schrepfer, was very close with the family and often fed the Benoit family pets when they were away. Nancy and Holly were longtime friends and often talked about their marriage woes together. Holly would recall noticing how recklessly Chris drove up the driveway to drop off Danielle. Chris would then drive 40 miles over to his physician, Dr. Phil Astin. This was no routine checkup. According to Dr. Astin, Chris had stopped by to, quote, just to see my staff, end quote. Now I'm gonna be real here, this is most likely a blatant lie. I say this because sometime after this interview, Dr. Astin was arrested and found guilty on 175 counts
of illegally prescribing painkillers and other drugs to many patients, including pro wrestler Chris Benoit.
There's no way someone as busy as Benoit is going to drive over 40 miles, basically an hour and a half, just to say hi to the staff at his doctor's clinic. Nevertheless, Astin declined to comment if he prescribed Benoit anything, even though it was later discovered that he prescribed Zoloft to Chris, and Astin noted a couple things about what he and Benoit talked about. One, he had mentioned he prescribed testosterone to Chris because of the effects of his past steroid use. You see, after a while using that stuff, the body can have trouble naturally producing the correct amount of testosterone. Although this prescription in itself was problematic, as Dr. Astin was later charged with over prescribing Benoit. Prosecutors say it was, quote, in excess by 50% of FDA dosage guidelines. So he was going ham with this stuff. 2, according to some sources, Chris mentioned to Dr. Astin if Nancy was experiencing early onset menopause. Since Dr. Astin was overseeing both Chris and Nancy, he said he would look into it. After the check-in with Dr. Astin, Chris walked into the lobby and many fans greeted him. And that's when this picture was taken. This is the last known picture of Chris in public, and little did anybody know, this would be just a few hours before he would tarnish his reputation forever. His friend Robert Howard, aka Hardcore Holly, mentioned Chris stated, "Hey, I just left Dr. Astin's office. I'm on my way home. How come you're not up here?" According to Robert, this was around 11:15 a.m. Apparently, Chris wanted Robert over for a while, but Robert declined because he wanted Chris to have proper family time. Chris wanted Robert over presumably for supportive reasons, but nobody truly knows why for sure. Around 11:50 a.m., Nancy would walk over to Holly Schrepfer's house to pick up Daniel. Holly would later state that she saw Nancy and Daniel walk safely back over to their residence. At 12:27 p.m., Chris would again speak with his friend Robert Howard, aka Hardcore Holly. Robert would go on to state Chris sounded normal during their conversation. Although when he had asked how Chris and Nancy were doing, Chris would go on to say she had been acting like Hitler, but they had worked out things and everything was fine. Holly had asked this because just a few weeks prior, Chris and Nancy had a fight in which Chris would leave the home and stay in a hotel. Here, Chris would get, quote, fucked up, end quote. Although this was nothing out of the ordinary, Chris had known issues with alcohol and the like. Chris would then go to lunch at a Moe's Southwest and also get his prescription filled. Then he made the drive to the Peachtree City and Tyrone exit off of I-85. It was here that Chris would write a check for $650 for an order of tights, custom made by Raymond Rawls, aka Rick Michaels. This was a double order for Chris Benoit and Chris Masters. Benoit was supposed to give Chris Masters his tights during the pay-per-view on Saturday. But, as you know, Benoit never showed up for that. Rick Michaels went on to state that nothing appeared out of the ordinary with Benoit, and he did not act any different than their prior meetings. It is believed after this transaction, Chris would go home and prepare for the cookout he was planning with Danielle. Once at home, around 3:45 p.m., Chris would also call Nancy and speak with her while she was out grocery shopping. Then another time at 3:53 p.m., and finally Chris would also call Aqua Pro at 3:54 p.m. to set up a pool cleaning service for later that evening. This receipt from Publix places Nancy Benoit's last purchase at 5:19 p.m. to the tune of $203. Her cashier, Alyssa, would be the last person to speak with her out in public. She would then drive 11 minutes and get home around 5:30. 9 minutes later, Nancy would answer a call from the guys at Aqua Pro requesting the Benoit family to put the animals in a good place for them to service the pool. Once all the groceries were unloaded, Chris and his son Daniel would begin having a cookout around 5:45 p.m. Although they were having a great time in the pool prior to this. We know this because Aqua Pro employees Andrew Webb and Patrick Sterling arrived around 6:20 p.m. and recalled seeing Chris and Daniel in their wet swim trunks. They also remembered seeing them cooking out upon leaving the residence. Just 3 hours after this happened at 9:25 p.m., a 411 call would be made to retrieve the number for the Fayetteville Police Department. Although this number would be the non-emergency line and nobody would actually end up calling the number. Then at 9:32 and 9:33 p.m., their neighbor, Holly Schrepfer, would receive 2 phone calls from the house's main line. Although she did not answer them at the time, she would also get yet another call at 10 p.m. She often wonders had she picked up the phone if anything would have been different. Well, this isn't the butterfly effect, so no take-backsies. While nobody knows the exact details, at some point Friday night inside the Benoit family bonus room/office, Chris and Nancy got into an argument. Maybe it was over the life insurance policy Chris accredited to his ex-wife's name, or maybe it was a number of other issues we will go over later in this video. But at some point in the argument, it had turned physical and Chris binded Nancy's ankles and wrist together. According to Nancy's autopsy, she had 4 different substances in her system at the time, one being alcohol, with Nancy having a blood alcohol level of 0.184, although they weren't sure if it was because of the body decomposing or not. 2, 3, and 4 being a therapeutic level of hydrocodone, hydromorphone, and alprazolam in her system as well. It's also unclear if the level found was actually higher prior to her expiring, but it's not believed she had nearly as much in her system as Danielle had during his demise. There was also a blunt impact to her head as well, which indicated Chris put his hands on her in a rather atrocious way. Add that to the bruising she had on her lower body on top of the main hemorrhaging and the soft tissues of her upper back and mid-chest, which is consistent with the theory that Chris did in fact kneel into her back while pulling 2 distinct ligatures around her throat. Usually I hear people talk about the telephone cord that he used to accomplish this, but many don't know Chris also used an actual tan rope as well. He looped the telephone cord around her neck once and looped the tan rope twice. However, this was actually tied together with the rope. Basically, these 2 ligatures were intertwined. The telephone cord had one end tied to her left wrist and another end tied to her right wrist. There was also somehow a connection between the wrist with this cord using a knot, which creates a very bondage-like image actually. As mentioned before, her ankles and wrist were binded together, ankles being tied up with electrical tape and wrists tied up with an S cable, indicating that after their initial struggle, he tied her up and then he pressed into her back and finished her off. He then wrapped her in a blanket, placed a pillow near her head and a pillow near her feet, and finally placed a Bible next to her body. Authorities also found a balled up combination of a tube sock and tape inside the kitchen trash, which appeared to have dried up blood on it. This led police to believe it was being used as a makeshift gag prior to Nancy's demise. A DNA test would later prove the blood on this gag was Nancy Benoit's. I can't imagine the feelings Chris Benoit had while he did these horrid acts. To do what he did, it really was. We're going to take a quick ad break before getting into the more touchy side of this story. I know you guys have noticed a custom-made shirt I have on in this video, so like the great Kendrick Lamar once said, let me put y'all on game. I got this piece from DeadThreads 47, and they're the sponsor of this video. They actually reached out randomly and asked me what were some of my favorite anime of all time. I gave them a decent sized list, and they whipped this magnificent work up. I've worn this shirt out in public several times, and I always get a compliment on it. The quality of this is incredible, and it's a comfy piece. DeadThreads are eco-friendly and give older clothing a second life by modernizing it. Everything is handmade and quality checked individually. You may have noticed I call my shirt a piece because I genuinely consider it a work of art. The craftsmanship done on this clothing is exceptional. They are currently working on a more personalized site, but until then you can primarily reach them by their Instagram page. Or if you're in the greater Petersburg area in Florida, they are serving brick and mortar at Wendy's Closet. This is how you will get your very own custom one-of-one piece made. If reaching out online, tell them Evil sent you for a special discount on the price. Special thanks again to DeadThreads. Now back to the video. Just a few hours after Nancy had met her end, Chris went upstairs to Danielle's bedroom. It was here that Danielle was heavily sedated with alprazolam. He was then flipped over, with his belly facing the bed, and then Chris pushed his head into the pillow and smothered him. It would only take a few moments for the boy to expire, and a child's Bible was later placed next to his body as well. Chris would regret doing this, as police later discovered some of the frantic searches he did on the family computer. One was a passage about the prophet Elijah. This was not the first time Benoit looked up this passage on his home computer. He did it twice before earlier in the year, back on January 23rd in 2007. When authorities reached out to the family pastor to get more insight into this biblical chapter, he stated he didn't know for sure, but it may have been a way for Chris Benoit to say to God that if you are real, this is a way to show me so and return life to my family. Chris would also search up the quickest way to, delete his own save files on his main system. At 8:30 a.m. Saturday morning, Chris would contact Holly Schrepfer and leave a message on her voicemail. In this voicemail, Chris was curious if Danielle was supposed to be at horse riding camp that morning. He advised that Danielle was sick and would not be able to make it. This entire interaction struck Holly as pretty odd, because Chris was somewhat antisocial and didn't usually initiate conversation with the Schrepfers. This was usually a very Nancy thing to do. Nevertheless, Holly would eventually call Chris back at 3:01 p.m. Chris kept up the lie that Danielle was sick and even asked Holly if any of her family was sick. He then went on and stated Nancy had a touch of food poisoning and that they were all going to lay low for a few days. At 3:30 p.m. on Saturday, June 23rd, Chavo Guerrero received a voicemail message from Chris's phone stating that Chris had overslept, missed his flight, and would be late for the show in Beaumont, Texas. Chavo heard this voicemail and called Chris back, and Chris was very tired and groggy on the phone. Chris then confirmed everything that he had said in his voice message. They talked for a while and everything seemed okay, but then Chris said,
Chavo. I go, yeah, and he goes, I love you.
And this struck Chavo as kind of odd. Not that they never said that they loved each other before, but because of how Chris said it, it left Chavo with a very uneasy feeling. Chavo, who was very concerned about Chris's tone and demeanor, called Chris back 12 minutes later after this. But Chris did not answer, and Chavo left a message stating, please, just call me back. Not long after that, at 3:44 p.m., Chris would call Chavo back, stating that he did not answer the call because he was on the phone with Delta Airlines changing his flight.
And I go, hey man, are you all right? I'm fine, man. Like I said, I just had a real hard weekend, and just real hard weekend, and I had to go take him, Daniel and Nancy to the hospital, and I'm like, oh, okay, man. Well, I'm here. Okay, man. Okay, cool. So then hung up. And that was the last I actually talked to him.
The funny thing here is Chris actually did call Delta Airlines and change his flight, which led many people to believe that he had plans to make the show in Beaumont even after all the horrible things he had just did. 4 p.m. This is the time where Chris looked up the old Bible passage about the prophet Elijah and read about trying to return the soul to the body of the kid and all that stuff, and also looked up how to quickly and efficiently At 5:30 p.m., Scott James, aka Scott Armstrong, one of Chris Benoit's best friends, called Chris while Scott was outside the airport. Scott was beginning to worry as this was the big day and Chris was nowhere to be found. Chris stated that things were stressful due to Nancy and Danielle being sick with food poisoning, and he wasn't sure that he would make it to the show. And if Chris somehow did, he would be late. Chris then asked Scott to call one of their bosses named Fit and tell him of the situation. 5 minutes later, at 5:35 p.m., Benoit called WWE Talent Relations and told them the same thing. Then at 6:10 p.m., another representative of WWE Talent Relations called Chris back. This representative asked Chris what time he was getting into Beaumont, Texas. Chris responded he was leaving Atlanta at 9:20 p.m. EST, and then he'll be arriving into Beaumont at 9:24 p.m. Central Time. The rep told Chris that it would be too late to make the event in Beaumont, and then advised Chris to take a flight to Houston instead. Since Chris couldn't make the original event, he would then go to the Vengeance pay-per-view on Sunday night. 3 minutes later, yet another rep called Chris to confirm the travel plans, but he never answered.
Sunday.
Early Sunday morning, between 3:51 and 3:58 a.m., Chris sent 5 text messages to Scott Armstrong and Chavo Guerrero. The first text message was, my physical address is 130 Green Meadow Lane, Fayetteville, Georgia, 30215. The second text message, the dogs are in the enclosed pool area. Garage side door is open. The other 3 messages was just sending the physical address again. The peculiar thing about these messages was, besides the fact that they were sent from both Chris and Nancy's cell phones, they also were sent to 2 people that already knew where Chris lived. Why would Chris send his best friends his physical address? Chavo Guerrero was at his house just a week prior. It's believed that after Chris sent these messages, he would take his final steps to the family basement and enter the gym area. Here, Chris would utilize his lat pull-down machine and set his weights on the highest setting. He then placed 2 40-pound dumbbells on top of the weighted stack to make it even heavier. Chris would then place a white cloth around himself in a manner to keep the nylon from the weight machine from cutting his skin. This nylon piece was then placed around that cloth. He then faced the weight machine and held 2 100-pound dumbbells at his sides and let the machine do the rest of the work. What's interesting about this entire case is that all 3 family members succumbed to some form of strangulation. I wonder why Chris chose this method over any others. It's a very personal and intimate way to do someone in.
Monday, June 25th, 2007.
At this point, both Chavo and Scott were feeling very uneasy about Chris being MIA, and so they notified WWE of the text messages that they were sent. WWE would then make several attempts to contact Chris via phone and text message. They also checked local hospitals in the area, but there was no contact made with Benoit. At 12:45 p.m., WWE finally contacted the Fayetteville County Sheriff's Office and requested them to do a welfare check on the Benoit family residence. At 2:39 p.m., the police finally arrived at the Benoit family residence and was unable to access the property due to the dogs being out in the yard. There was a real concern that the dogs would protect the property by attacking the officers, so they enlisted the help of neighbor Holly Schrepfer, and she was able to put the dogs away. However, Holly also did a short check inside the house and found the bodies of Nancy and Daniel. She did not check the basement because she felt something was very wrong down there and immediately ran out with the news. 4 p.m. WWE received a call from the Fayetteville County Sheriff's Office advising that they entered the Benoit family residence and found 3 deceased bodies. WWE was then told the Benoit family home was now considered a major crime scene. When we discuss crimes like this, it's important to note what may have led up to this action. Let's go over some of Benoit's history together.
Well, the wrestling world in shock today. Former champion Chris Benoit found dead in his Atlanta home along with his wife and young son. Police now treating the discovery as a double murder-suicide.
Chris Benoit was born May 21st, 1967 in Montreal, Canada. He later moved to Edmonton, Alberta, where he spent most of his childhood. When Benoit was 6 years old, he suffered a mild traumatic brain injury after hitting his head during a car accident. He would later be hospitalized for 3 days because of this. Despite how traumatic the event must have been for him, he suffered no obvious signs of long-term injury from this encounter. However, it's important to note that this is the first official head injury we have for Benoit on record. Benoit always had a love for wrestling, and his adolescence was spent studying and admiring the greats of the past. Dynamite Kid and Bret Hart were his 2 favorites growing up. His love for their work would provide the groundwork for his own career. Chris Benoit would train under many people: Gerry Morrow, Angel Acevedo, and of course Bret Hart's father, Stu Hart. Learning all that he could inside the historical Hart family gym, nicknamed the Dungeon. It was through a culmination of these efforts that he would debut in 1985. Now, usually I wouldn't go back this far when discussing true crime, but I thought it was very interesting to note how Stu Hart actually trained his wrestlers. Even though he had a hand in creating some of the greatest wrestlers to ever do it, literally speaking, since he's the father of Bret and Owen Hart, he's also had some terrible stories come out about his own practices from his very own fighters. A notable one came from pro wrestler Adrian Street, as he recalled one of the most disturbing tales I've ever heard, stating, "He was a very cruel and spiteful man actually. What he would do is a newcomer, a new guy who would go there wanting to learn to wrestle, instead of teaching him, he'd put a lot of the guys on there that were really good shooters or what have you to wrestle with him first. And they would purposely beat the crap out of him, and they would run him around until he was exhausted. Then Stu, when the guy was still on the canvas, would put him in a horrible hold with his full weight on the guy's chest. So the guy would be hyperventilating like you wouldn't believe. Then he'd do a thing called mugging. He'd cup his hand over the guy's mouth and pinch his nostrils. So the guy was just about passing out. He'd have him screaming. He goes on to recall a time where Stu did this and a trainee defecated on themselves and subsequently Stu. And even recalls a tape that the Harts had, basically a compilation of Stu doing this to a bunch of trainees with Stu laying on top of them and them screaming and writhing in pain. Now, this video isn't about Stu. It's about Chris Benoit, a student of Stu's. And I think this may have had a hand into certain things coming into fruition. Chris was put into the world of wrestling since the age of 12 and signed to Stu's business, Stampede Wrestling, when he turned 18. I like to think of Stu in a similar vein as Joe Jackson. He did some horrendous stuff, but his methods produced fantastic wrestlers. I'm talking Chris Jericho, The Edge, Mark Henry, Roddy Piper, Billy Graham, and the list goes on. Around this period of Chris's life, he would adopt a very troubling move. A move that now in 2024 has a terrible reputation. It has caused a long list of brain injuries and spine injuries across a crazy amount of wrestlers. Even the creator of this move said it was the most stupidest thing he had ever came up with. This move is, of course, the Diving Headbutt. Funnily enough, Benoit stated that he was never going to use this move because the first time he used it, his head almost landed full impact onto the ring canvas. He recalled being close to passing out after having the wind knocked out of him. This is the earliest known career head injury that we know of on record. And throughout Benoit's career, he racked up an awful lot. Benoit was in the ring professionally for 22 years, and even more if you count his training days. He held 32 championships and was a 2-time world champion. He was even supposed to win a 3rd world championship on the night he ended his family. With all this head trauma, it's a miracle Benoit was able to function normally in his day-to-day life. And to make matters worse, Benoit also struggled with various addictions. When he wrestled with WCW, Benoit would pop E almost every night. If you're not familiar with X, it's a party drug that is popular in rave scenes. This specific substance is not very friendly to your brain, especially when abused long term. It can cause a myriad of cognitive deficiencies. Oh my God, tell them. Say it with your chest. Long-term abuse of X can cause permanent damage to the brain. It can even affect cognitive reasoning, impair memory, inhibit speech recognition, lower intelligence, and even cause chronic psychosis. I've read up a lot about this case and nobody seems to mention this. People usually point to the long-term brain damage that Benoit caused himself throughout his career, or the long-term alcohol abuse or steroid abuse, but never specifically party drugs. And honestly, many of his friends also had a problem. One friend that comes to mind is Eddie Guerrero, but we'll get to him in a second. Benoit's brain was so damaged that it looked like a brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer patient. Benoit's brain was so damaged by wrestling, taking drugs, abusing alcohol, and skipping sleep that his brain looked like someone that was at the end of their lives, with a chronic condition that gradually destroys memory and thinking skills. There was damage in all 4 lobes and his brainstem, and in his autopsy, it was revealed he had severe chronic traumatic encephalopathy, aka CTE. Benoit was 40 years old when he passed away. His brain was 45 years older than his body. And if all of this wasn't bad enough, he was no stranger to losing friends in the ring.
I only know that I love you. I miss you.
In 1999, during a WWE pay-per-view event titled Over the Edge,
no pun intended,
Benoit's lifelong friend, Owen Hart, would fall over 78 feet and critically injure himself. After falling face first into the southwest side of the ring, Owen had broken his upper left arm and bruised up his entire body. The cause of death was later revealed to be internal bleeding from blunt force trauma. This is because when Owen fell, the left side of his chest hit the ropes near the turnbuckle. This specific impact ruptured and severed his aorta, resulting in Hart, essentially drowning in his own blood. EMTs would rush him to the hospital, but it was simply too late for Owen. This story isn't all doom and gloom though, because Owen actually saved the life of the referee that was standing in the same corner he fell. While falling, Owen yelled, "Look out!" and he alerted the referee early enough for them to move. And if you wanted to hate Vince McMahon just a little bit more, when this was all going down, Vince never actually stopped the show. While this happened live, fans from home watched a promo video of Owen, and the fans in the stadium were all watching the large screens they had set up for his entrance. Though some fans actually saw Owen fall. After he fell, he was moved off the canvas and the show went on like nothing ever happened. However, the announcers did let everyone know that he died when they later got the news. So imagine you're in the stands of a wrestling show that you paid for, and you notice that one of the acts literally just fell from the ceiling 75 feet, almost hitting a referee and then hitting a turnbuckle. I mean, that is a surreal experience. Owen's death prompted Benoit to go back to Calgary to help console the Hart family. Throughout the years, Benoit faced many losses over his career. But there's one death that many state was the beginning of the end of Chris Benoit. This is, of course, the death of Eddie Guerrero.
Viva la raza!
On November 8, 2005, Eddie Guerrero would die of heart failure in a Marriott hotel before a show. Chavo Guerrero, Eddie's nephew, found Eddie laid out after security notified him that Eddie was in trouble. Over the years, Eddie battled with substance abuse. He had many issues with alcohol and pills, and though he tried to stop many times, he was often in and out of rehab. He was no stranger to the nightlife, and as such, Chavo was somewhat used to seeing Eddie slumped over whenever he would overdo it. But this time, it was a little different, because at this point, Eddie was 4 years sober and had no problems with declining a drink, and while Chavo may have initially thought that Eddie had relapsed while on the way to his room, as soon as Chavo saw Eddie on the floor, he knew something was very wrong. I have no idea why, but according to Chavo's recollection of this story, the security personnel never called emergency services after finding Eddie on the floor. There's nothing in my head that says that this was a smart idea for them to do, because they literally had to force themselves into the room. They broke the door to get into the room after Eddie didn't respond to any wellness checks. You're already in the room, you broke into it, you see him on the floor, you contact his nephew, but not emergency personnel? Like, why? Why did that happen? A little later in the day, Chris would find out the news straight from Chavo, and this is what happened.
And I'm like, Chris, sit down. Are you sitting down? He goes, yeah. So I told Chris, and Chris was like, I never heard somebody wail like that, like this deep moan, like, oh, like I just, punched him in the stomach and stole his soul. That's what it felt like, and I was like, and he was yelling and screaming, and just deep, oh, no, so. And then from there, I had to go back to the room. And
on top of dealing with losing friends and his brain injuries, he also had issues in his marriage, with Nancy even filing for divorce May 12th of 2003, citing that the marriage was irrevocably broken. During this time, she also filed a protective order against Chris right on top of that. She was adamant that she was the victim of cruel treatment from Chris, but shockingly, she dropped the lawsuit in August 2003. I have to wonder, if she never stopped the divorce proceedings, would she and Daniel still be alive today?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Last night on Monday Night Raw, the WWE presented a special tribute show, recognizing the career of Chris Benoit. However, now some 26 hours later, the facts of this horrific tragedy are now apparent. Therefore, other than my comments, there will be no mention of Mr. Benoit's name tonight. On the contrary, tonight's show will be dedicated to everyone who has been affected by this terrible incident. This evening marks the first step of the healing process.
This healing process would include WWE's slow erasure of Benoit from all of their relevant media, even going as far as removing Benoit's name from many matches in their archive. If you don't know what this means, imagine that you're bored and you suddenly decide to watch one of the greatest triple threat matches of all time. WrestleMania 20. This match, of course, features Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and Chris Benoit. Looking up this match by typing in Benoit's name would produce 0 results. To find this match, you would quite literally have to type in Shawn Michaels and or Triple H. You would not see Benoit's name anywhere on the site. This is just a small aspect of how WWE has separated themselves from Chris Benoit. Unfortunately, they, in my opinion, went a little too far in these actions and actually minimized Nancy's career by erasing her legacy alongside Chris Benoit, which is completely unfair and messed up. Nancy is essentially being remembered these days for being a victim and not remembered for her incredible career that she had long before she ever met Chris. So I'm actually going to delineate here and cover one of the most important women in wrestling history. Nancy Elizabeth Toffaloni, aka the Fallen Angel, and more popularly, Woman. I know I did a little accent there, okay? You know, I'm from New York, okay? I'm from New York, all right? So, you know, I've been around Italians for a large percentage of my lifetime, okay? Leave me alone. Nancy was born May 17th, 1964 in Boston, Massachusetts. Eventually moving to Florida and graduating from D-Land High School, Nancy's life was on the up and up. She would marry her high school sweetheart, Jim Dowse, and through their shared love of wrestling, she would luck out while attending an event. It was here in 1983, at the age of 19, she'd meet wrestling photographer Bill Astin. While working diligently in her main job being a clerk at State Farm, Nancy would utilize her free time well and do gigs here and there for Bill. It would only take a year of hard work and dedication for her big break to happen in showbiz, where she was acquainted with New York Wrestling magazine editor George Napolitano. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering his name. I'm sorry. Through her work with George, she'd meet Kevin Sullivan and begin her work as the Fallen Angel. Unfortunately for her partner Jim, this would spell disaster for their marriage and the two would get divorced
pretty soon after that.
When she got home one trip, we started talking. I said, Nance, you know, I really think that I am holding you back. Us being married is holding you back.
Wow.
We are starting to grow apart. I want to think about this. And right after we thought about this for about 2 days, after I picked her up at the airport, we talked about it. We decided, let's separate and see what happens. As soon as we separated, her career just took off like crazy.
Regardless, Nancy used this opportunity to create wrestling history and had an incredible run as a manager. She managed names from Kevin Sullivan, Ric Flair, Doom, Shane Douglas, Rick Steiner, Sandman, and of course Chris Benoit during her career. Her work with various wrestling heels was always entertaining, and she played her part well, pushing the envelope for all women inside the industry of wrestling. If you don't know what a heel is in wrestling, it's basically a word that refers to the villain or antagonist of a wrestling storyline. An example of a great heel would be Macho Man Randy Savage, The Miz, or even Randy Orton. These characters gave the audience a riveting story that's not just a bunch of guys in tights throwing each other around. They brought meaning to the stories that the writers told. I want to also take a quick moment to thank Nancy's sister, Sandra Toffaloni, who dedicated a lot of time into giving Nancy the recognition she deserves. Sandra has been instrumental in me being able to show you guys the more intimate moments of the Benoit family, as well as seeing impressive and high quality photos of Nancy throughout her years. She is the reason why at Nancy_Benoit_tribute even exists. Please consider giving her a follow on her TikTok at AuntieZaZaOG, and please consider smashing my subscribe button while you're at it. Now going back to Chris Benoit, the erasure of his career is not an understatement, but it does make sense. WWE is a family-friendly organization, and they don't want to glorify someone who did such a horrible and heinous crime against their own family. Had Chris simply removed himself from the equation, then this would be an entirely different video. I'd wager no one would think he isn't deserving of being in the WWE Hall of Fame. The truth is, because of what he did, he is a horrible person and a literal scumbag for doing what he did. His actions are inexcusable in every way. Even his most diehard fans cannot justify his actions. Instead, they blame Kevin Sullivan for the deaths of the Benoit family. Let me be clear. There is many theories floating around that someone killed the Benoit family, Kevin Sullivan. Hell, there's even a theory that someone who was close enough to the family was let in with zero resistance. Again, Kevin Sullivan did these crimes. This post on the screen is bullshit. And this post here, and this post here. All of this is fabricated wishes by delusional people. Just because the initial information wasn't perfect, they are calling into question every coincidence under the sun to make an extremely absurd claim seem plausible. I have a habit of not speaking my mind 100% on people like this. So let me be very clear. Chris Benoit is actually evil. That is what I think 100%. However, I do think that there was 6 important factors that we should take into consideration. Number 1, Chris Benoit had CTE.
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
This is a cognitive deficiency in the brain, okay? His brain is literally deteriorating. I'm going to just say it. His brain was just, it was out of whack. It wasn't even really a brain anymore. He gets a little bit of a pass for that. However, he still did what he did in full mind with whatever brain he had left. So again, I'm not going to let him completely slide, but I am going to say, yes, that is a factor in this, okay? Number 2, long-term abuse of alcohol and drugs. He took a lot of party drugs over the years. They had a lot of crazy parties and wrestling. His best friend was Eddie Guerrero. He had a problem with drinking. He had a problem with drugs as well, okay? Birds of a feather flock together. They were doing their thing. We are not made to withstand such abuse for such a long time. Just doesn't happen that way. Number 3, his marriage issues. He had a lot of marriage issues. He and Nancy were going back and forth, bickering at each other. It was just a very toxic environment. I imagine it wasn't really helping that he was doing the whole life insurance thing. And also before that was the whole divorce papers thing and even the domestic violence lawsuit. That is a lot to go through, okay? Number 4, grief from losing many of his friends. Wrestlers have a habit of abusing a certain kind of drug that makes every single muscle inside their body enlarged, including their hearts. It's no surprise that he lost friends over the years. Some of the friends were just lost in very insane ways, like the entire Owen Hart situation. Complete tragedy, a complete mistake, and shouldn't have never happened, to be honest with you, but it happened, okay? Number 5, his obvious depression from all of this happening at once. Even the best of people wouldn't be able to get out unscathed when going through stuff like this. This is a lot to go through, okay? Number 6, his anxiety and fear of the potential end of his career. You see, the truth is Benoit was getting old, and Chris and Nancy were talking in talks about him slowing down and creating a wrestling school, something that he could do after he finishes off with wrestling. Now, I'm not saying that he was going to finish wrestling right then and there or even in the next few years, but it was coming on the horizon. And whereas before it wasn't even a thought in his head, now it was a really real conversation that he had to come to terms with. This is his only job. He has never had a real job outside of wrestling, okay? He hasn't been a cashier, busboy, or anything, a bartender, nothing. He has just been a wrestler, okay? Ever since he was a kid to being an adult. Just a wrestler. That's all he's ever done. That's all he's ever made money off of. That's his complete identity. Of course, he's going to have a bit of a crisis. Keep in mind, because I'm saying this, I'm not excusing his behavior. We can't let nostalgia hold us back from being honest with ourselves. He did something terrible, okay? Incredible wrestler, but what he did was unforgivable, obviously, right? But anyways, that's it. That's my essay. You know, I planned on making this video a long time ago, but things just got in the way. I'm happy to see so many people who are true fans of wrestling in my comment section. It actually means a lot. If you like this video, please consider hitting the like button, and if you dislike it, then don't. Also, please consider becoming an ally of evil, okay? You put the ally in actually evil. Please hit that subscribe button. It really does help trying to get to 20,000. That's our new goal right now, which is incredible to say, amazing to say. We just hit 15,000. Thank you guys so much for still supporting this channel, even though I have been AWOL. Again, I'm going to try my hardest not to do anything like that. In fact, I'm never going to do anything like that ever again, because I am taking this 1,000% serious, okay? I've always been, but like this is a bit different. I got a lot of stuff out of the way. More content is on the way. Thank you guys for watching, and peace.
I am woman. I'm not a valet. I'm not a manager. What I will be is the woman who will conquer the wrestling world. Not since Cleopatra ruled her Nile kingdom has there been such a woman to conquer the world. I will rule the wrestling world. There's an old saying, behind every successful man, there stands a woman. This woman stands behind no man.